The C-130 Hercules groaned through Afghan airspace at 3:47 hours, its aluminum belly heavy with the weight of 23 Navy SEALs returning from a classified operation in the Kandahar province. The interior lighting cast everything in that familiar military amber glow, the color of exhaustion, of missions completed, of warriors heading home. Most of the operators sat in silence, their faces masks of professional stoicism, weapons secured, eyes forward. The only sounds were the steady drone of turboprops and the occasional crackle of radio chatter from the cockpit. In the back corner, curled against a canvas jump seat with her flight jacket pulled up to her chin, was what appeared to be a sleeping crew member. Small frame, dark hair escaping from beneath a worn baseball cap, combat boots that looked like they'd seen more miles than most soldiers see in a lifetime. To the casual observer, she was just another Air Force transport specialist catching some rest between missions. The SEALs barely glanced her way, just another face in the machinery of war, invisible in the way that support personnel often are to the tip of the spear operators. But Lieutenant Commander Jake "Reaper" Morrison wasn't looking casually. Something about the sleeping figure nagged at him, a recognition dancing at the edges of his memory like heat shimmer on desert asphalt. 22 years of special operations had taught him to trust those instincts, to pay attention when his subconscious started sending signals. He studied the worn leather jacket, the calloused hands, the way even in sleep she maintained perfect situational awareness, one ear always listening, body positioned for quick movement. The aircraft banked slightly, beginning its descent toward Bagram Air Base, and that's when Morrison saw it. As she shifted in her sleep, her jacket fell open just enough to reveal a small patch on her flight suit. Not Regulation Air Force, not Transport Command. It was faded, nearly invisible in the dim light, but Morrison's eyes were trained to catch details others missed. The patch was round, black background, with a silver bird of prey clutching lightning bolts. Below it, barely legible stitching, "Night Stalkers don't quit." Morrison's blood went cold. Night Stalkers, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the most elite helicopter pilots in the world, the ones who flew into impossible places at impossible hours, who delivered special operations forces to targets that existed only in classified briefings and congressional nightmares. But that wasn't what made his hand start to shake. It was the smaller patch just below it, one that made him question everything he thought he knew about the sleeping figure in the corner. A simple name tape, worn beyond regulation, that read a single word: Viper. Morrison's mouth went dry. Every operator in the special operations community knew that call sign, knew the legend, knew the story that had become whispered folklore in the bars of Fort Campbell and the ready rooms of Coronado. But the stories always said Viper was dead. The Hercules touched down with a jarring thud that woke everyone aboard. As the aircraft rolled to a stop and the cargo ramp began to lower, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filing out with his team, he walked to the back of the aircraft where the figure was now stretching, preparing to disembark. She looked up at him with eyes that held depths he'd only seen in the faces of warriors who'd been to hell and somehow found their way back. Without hesitation, without explanation to his confused teammates, Lieutenant Commander Morrison stopped, came to attention, and rendered the sharpest salute of his military career. The entire cargo bay fell silent. 22 hardened Navy SEALs turned to stare at their commander, saluting what they'd assumed was just another Air Force mechanic. But Morrison knew better. Standing before him, slightly embarrassed by the attention but accepting the salute with quiet dignity, was Captain Alexandra "Viper" Reyes, the most decorated combat pilot of her generation. The woman who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. 3 years earlier, Captain Reyes had been at the controls of a modified MH-60M Black Hawk, call sign Ghost Rider 6, flying a nighttime insertion mission deep into the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Intelligence had located a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for orchestrating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces. The mission was supposed to be routine by special operations standards. Insert a 12-man SEAL team, provide overwatch, extract on signal. Viper had flown hundreds of similar missions, threading the needle between mountain peaks in conditions that would ground civilian aircraft indefinitely. But that night everything went wrong. The intelligence was bad, the landing zone was compromised, and what should have been a clean insertion turned into a nightmare of tracer fire and rocket-propelled grenades. The SEALs found themselves pinned down in a valley with no cover, taking casualties, with Taliban fighters moving in from 3 sides. Their only hope was extraction, but the original landing zone was now a kill box. Viper had a choice: follow protocol and call for additional support, which would take 40 minutes they didn't have, or attempt something that existed only in the realm of theoretical flight training. The valley was too narrow, the winds too unpredictable, the enemy fire too concentrated. Every manual, every regulation, every voice of reason said it was impossible to extract the team from their position. Which is exactly why she decided to try. The next 18 minutes became the stuff of legend. Viper brought her Black Hawk down into a valley barely wider than her rotor diameter, flying by instinct and feel more than instruments, trading altitude for speed in a dance with physics that defied rational explanation. Enemy fire turned the night into a light show of tracers and explosions, but somehow, impossibly, she managed to hover long enough for all 12 SEALs to board. That's when the RPG struck her tail boom. The explosion should have sent them spinning into the mountainside, should have ended the story in flames and twisted metal. Instead, Viper flew the dying aircraft out of the valley on pure will, and whatever aerodynamic forces she could coax from damaged rotors and failing hydraulics. She auto-rotated into a clearing 3 miles away, a controlled crash that should have been impossible but somehow kept all 13 people aboard alive. The rescue that followed was classified at levels that ensured the story would never make headlines, would never earn medals, would never be anything more than whispered rumors among the special operations community. By the time help arrived, Viper was unconscious from blood loss, her left leg shattered, her career seemingly over. The official reports listed the incident as a mechanical failure during a routine transport mission. The classified addendum, read only by a handful of officers with need-to-know clearance, recommended Captain Reyes for the Medal of Honor. She refused it, said she was just doing her job, said the real heroes were the men she'd extracted, the ones who'd completed the mission despite impossible odds. The medal disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, and Viper disappeared into medical retirement, her injuries too severe for continued flight status. Or so everyone believed. Now she stood in the cargo bay of a C-130, very much alive, very much still serving, accepting Morrison's salute with the quiet grace of someone who'd never sought recognition, but had earned more respect than most soldiers see in a lifetime. The confusion on the faces of his team was understandable. They were looking at a ghost, a legend, a warrior who'd been written off and forgotten by everyone except those who knew the real story. Morrison finally lowered his salute, but his eyes never left hers. "Captain Reyes," he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional memory. "I served with Tommy Martinez, 2nd Platoon, SEAL Team 6. He told me what you did in the Quarangle, said you saved his life." A shadow of pain crossed Viper's face, the kind that comes from remembering friends who didn't make it home. "Martinez was a good man," she said simply. "How is he?" Morrison's expression darkened. "KIA, Helmand Province, 2 years ago." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of shared loss. Finally, Viper nodded, shouldering a worn flight bag that looked like it had seen action on every continent. "He died doing what he believed in. That's more than most people get." She moved toward the cargo ramp, but Morrison stepped into her path. "Captain, with respect, what are you doing here? Last I heard, you were medically retired, teaching flight school at Rucker." Viper's smile was thin, revealing nothing. "Things change, Commander. Wars don't win themselves." Before Morrison could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the controlled chaos of Bagram Air Base like smoke. But her presence lingered in the cargo bay, in the questions her appearance raised, in the sudden understanding that there were layers to this war, operations within operations, that even seasoned special operations officers weren't cleared to know about. As Morrison's team finally filed out of the aircraft, Petty Officer First Class Danny Diesel Thompson voiced what everyone was thinking. "Skipper, who the hell was that? And why did you salute her like she was the Secretary of Defense?" Morrison watched Viper's figure disappear into a crowd of ground crew and support personnel, noting how she moved with the purposeful invisibility of someone accustomed to operating in shadows. "That," he said finally, "was the reason half the guys in this unit are still breathing. And if she's here, it means something big is about to happen." He was right. Within 6 hours, Morrison's team would receive orders for a mission unlike anything they'd ever attempted. Within 12 hours, they'd understand why legends sometimes have to come back from the dead. And within 24 hours, they'd learn that some pilots don't just fly aircraft, they fly into history. But first, they had to understand who Viper really was, and why her presence at Bagram meant that somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains, someone was about to have a very bad day. The story of Alexandra Viper Reyes wasn't just about flying helicopters or saving lives or even about courage under fire. It was about the invisible wars fought by invisible warriors, the missions that never make the news, and the price of being so good at your job that your own government pretends you don't exist. 6 hours after touching down at Bagram, Morrison found himself in a briefing room that didn't officially exist, looking at satellite photos of a target that wasn't supposed to be there, planning a mission that would never appear in any official records. The briefing officer was a CIA operative who introduced himself only as Smith, a name so obviously false it might as well have been a joke. But nobody was laughing because the target was real, the threat was imminent, and the window of opportunity was measured in hours, not days. "Gentlemen," Smith said, clicking to the next slide, "3 days ago, we intercepted communications indicating that a high-value target has surfaced in the Spin Gar Mountains, approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Jalalabad. This individual has been responsible for coordinating attacks across eastern Afghanistan, specifically targeting coalition supply routes and forward operating bases." The satellite imagery showed a compound built into the mountainside, accessible only by a single road that serpentined up through terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Steep ridges, narrow valleys, and weather patterns that could change from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. It was the kind of place that existed specifically to be unreachable, a fortress built by geography and defended by the laws of physics. "The target will be at this location for approximately 18 hours, Smith continued. "After that, he disappears back into the network of caves and safe houses that have kept him invisible for the past 3 years. This is our one shot." Morrison studied the imagery, his experienced eye automatically calculating approach routes, landing zones, and extraction points. Everything he saw made his stomach tight. The compound was positioned on a narrow ledge, surrounded by peaks that rose nearly vertical from the valley floor. The single road was too exposed for ground assault, and the nearest suitable landing zone for conventional helicopters was 8 kilometers away, too far for insertion, too far for extraction. "Sir," Morrison said carefully, "with respect, I don't see how we get there. The terrain won't support standard insertion protocols, and even if we could get in, extraction would be impossible," Smith finished, "using conventional assets, which is why you won't be using conventional assets." The door at the back of the briefing room opened, and Viper walked in. She traded her casual flight jacket for a proper flight suit, but it wasn't Air Force blue or Army green. It was black, unmarked except for a single patch on her shoulder, a subdued American flag, and the words Special Activities Division. Morrison felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. SAD, the CIA's paramilitary arm. The people who did the jobs that were too sensitive for the military, too dangerous for regular intelligence operations. If Viper was SAD, it explained everything: her disappearance from official records, her resurrection from supposed medical retirement, her presence at Bagram. It also meant that whatever they were about to attempt was so far outside normal operational parameters that they needed someone who specialized in impossible missions. "Captain Reyes will be your pilot for this operation," Smith said, as if reading Morrison's thoughts. "She's been studying the target area for the past 72 hours and has developed an insertion plan that our flight dynamics experts assure me is theoretically possible." Viper moved to the front of the room, connecting a tablet to the briefing system. The satellite imagery was replaced by detailed topographical maps overlaid with flight paths that looked more like abstract art than practical aviation planning. "The direct approach won't work," she said without preamble. "Too exposed, too predictable, but there's another way." The map zoomed in on what appeared to be a river valley running perpendicular to the target area. Viper traced a path with a laser pointer, following the valley until it disappeared into a narrow canyon. "This drainage leads directly under the target compound. The canyon is approximately 60 meters wide at its narrowest point, with vertical walls rising 300 meters on either side." Morrison stared at the imagery, understanding dawning with a mixture of admiration and horror. "You want to fly through the canyon, below ground level, using the rock walls as cover." "Nap of the Earth doesn't describe it," Viper said. "This would be subterranean flying. We'd be invisible to radar, invisible to visual observation, and completely protected from ground fire, until the last 30 seconds. The laser pointer moved to show the canyon opening directly beneath the target compound, like a crack in the earth that led straight to their objective. It was brilliant, audacious, and completely insane. It was also, Morrison realized, probably the only way to reach an unreachable target. "What's the aircraft?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Modified MH-60M, Viper replied. "Stealth configuration, enhanced navigation systems, and a few upgrades that aren't in any manual. The bird's been specifically configured for this type of terrain following." Morrison nodded slowly. The MH-60M was the latest evolution of the Black Hawk, designed specifically for special operations. In Viper's hands with the right modifications, it might actually be capable of threading a needle through mountains. "Might." "Risk assessment?" he asked. Viper's expression didn't change. "High. If we lose power, hit unexpected weather, or encounter any mechanical issues during the canyon run, there's no recovery option. We either make it through or we don't." "And extraction?" "Same route reversed, but we'll have the advantage of surprise on insertion. Extraction will be different. They'll know we're coming." Smith cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I need to emphasize that this mission is compartmentalized at the highest levels. Success or failure, there will be no official record, no after-action reports, no congressional briefings. Captain Reyes and her aircraft don't exist. If something goes wrong, you were never there." Morrison looked around the room at his team. 12 hardened operators who'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions the Navy could conceive. They looked back at him with the steady confidence of professionals who understood that somebody had to do the impossible jobs, and they'd been chosen because they were the best at making impossible look routine. "When do we go?" he asked. "Tomorrow night," Smith replied. "New moon. Weather window opens at 2200 hours local time. Captain Reyes will conduct a final reconnaissance flight this afternoon, then brief you on specific insertion procedures." As the briefing concluded and his team filed out to begin mission preparation, Morrison lingered behind. Viper was gathering her materials, moving with the efficient economy of motion that marked all truly elite operators. When they were alone, he approached her. "Captain," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, those deep eyes studying him with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people's intentions. "Shoot. Are you sure about this? I mean, are you really sure we can thread a helicopter through a canyon in the dark, in mountains, carrying a full assault team?" Viper was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience that couldn't be taught in any school. "Commander, 3 years ago I crashed a helicopter that should have killed everyone aboard. Since then, I've had a lot of time to think about the difference between impossible and improbable." She paused, slinging her flight bag over her shoulder. "This mission, it's just improbable, and improbable is what I do." Morrison watched her leave, understanding finally why his salute had been instinctive. It wasn't just about respect for a fellow warrior, though that was part of it. It was recognition of something rarer, a professional who'd found their calling in the space between possible and impossible, who'd chosen to make a career out of defying odds that would break other people. Tomorrow night, his team would follow her into a canyon that most pilots wouldn't attempt in daylight with perfect weather. They'd trust their lives to her judgment, her skill, and her willingness to attempt something that existed at the very edge of what aircraft and human capability could achieve. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of mission that legends were built on. The only question was whether they'd live long enough to become legends themselves. The reconnaissance flight that afternoon was supposed to be routine, a high-altitude pass over the target area using long-range cameras and electronic surveillance equipment. Viper flew alone, her modified Black Hawk configured for intelligence gathering rather than assault. The aircraft climbed to 15,000 feet, well above small arms range, and began its systematic survey of the mountains that would become tomorrow night's battlefield. But routine reconnaissance became something else entirely when the radio crackled with an emergency transmission from Cobra Base, a forward operating post 30 kilometers south of the target area. The voice was tight with controlled panic, the kind of calm professionalism that meant someone was about to die if help didn't arrive immediately. Any aircraft, this is Cobra Base. We have troops in contact, taking heavy casualties, request immediate CAS and medical evacuation. GPS coordinates follow." Viper glanced at her navigation display, calculating distances and flight times. Cobra Base was 12 minutes away at maximum speed. The coordinates they'd transmitted put the firefight in a valley that she could reach in 8 minutes if she pushed the aircraft beyond normal operational limits. She keyed her radio, switching to the emergency frequency. "Cobra Base, this is Ghost Rider. I copy your transmission. What's your situation?" "Ghost Rider, we have a 10-man patrol that walked into an ambush. Estimated 30 to 40 enemy fighters with heavy weapons. We have 4 confirmed KIA, 3 wounded, and the survivors are pinned down in a dry riverbed with no cover. They won't last another 10 minutes. Viper was already banking toward the coordinates, pushing her throttles forward until the Black Hawk's turbines screamed with maximum power. The aircraft dove toward the valley floor, trading altitude for speed in a controlled fall that would have terrified most passengers. But Viper wasn't thinking about fear, she was calculating angles, distances, and the mathematical precision required to arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. "Cobra Base, I'm inbound your location. Be advised I'm a single aircraft with no escort, no close air support. What do you need most, suppression or extraction?" The pause before the answer told her everything she needed to know. When faced with an impossible choice, combat leaders learned to make decisions that would haunt them forever. "Ghost Rider, we need both, but if we have to choose, get our wounded out. The KIA can wait." Viper reached the valley in 7 minutes, coming in low and fast over terrain that looked like a moonscape. Below, She could see the firefight unfolding in real time. Muzzle flashes from concealed positions on both sides of a dry creek bed, the distinctive smoke trails of rocket-propelled grenades, and the desperate movements of soldiers trying to find cover where none existed. The ambush was perfectly executed. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on high ground overlooking a natural choke point, creating a kill zone that any military force would have to traverse. The American patrol had walked into it like a textbook example of what not to do in hostile terrain. But textbook examples were academic exercises. This was real bullets fired by real people at real soldiers who were bleeding into Afghan soil. Viper keyed her radio again. "Cobra Base, I have visual on your people. I count 6 effectives in the creek bed, enemy positions on ridgelines north and south. Can you mark your casualties?" "Negative, Ghost Rider. Too much fire. But the wounded are approximately 50 meters east of the main group." 50 meters might as well have been 50 miles when every inch of ground was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Viper circled the valley once, studying the terrain, the enemy positions, and the impossible mathematics of extraction under fire. Everything about the situation screamed for her to call for backup, to wait for attack helicopters and ground reinforcement. Everything except the voices on the radio, growing weaker with each transmission. She made her decision with the same calm precision that had defined her entire career. "Cobra Base, I'm coming in. When you see me in the valley, pop smoke and get your wounded ready to move. You'll have maybe 90 seconds. Ghost Rider, be advised, enemy has RPGs and heavy machine guns. This is not a secure LZ." "Copy that, Cobra Base. It's about to get very loud down there." What happened next would be discussed in military aviation circles for years afterward, analyzed in classified reports, and whispered about in the kind of bars where helicopter pilots gathered to tell stories about the crazy things they'd seen and done. Viper brought her Black Hawk down into the valley like a falling meteor, using terrain features to mask her approach until the last possible moment. When she emerged from behind a ridge line, she was flying at 80 knots, 15 feet above the ground, directly toward the center of an active firefight. Every enemy weapon in the valley swung toward her aircraft, filling the air with tracers and the distinctive crack of bullets passing through rotor wash. But Viper had anticipated this, had planned for it, had turned their attention to her aircraft into a tactical advantage. While every Taliban fighter was shooting at the helicopter, they weren't shooting at the soldiers in the creek bed. For 90 precious seconds, the American patrol had the respite they needed to move, to gather their wounded, to prepare for extraction. Viper used those 90 seconds to conduct a masterpiece of tactical flying, weaving between enemy positions while drawing fire away from the troops on the ground. She took hits, lots of them. Bullets punched through her aircraft's aluminum skin, shattered instruments, and filled the cockpit with the acrid smell of electrical fires. Her left engine started running rough, oil pressure dropping toward dangerous levels. Hydraulic fluid began spraying across her windscreen, making it nearly impossible to see. But she kept flying, kept drawing fire, kept providing the cover that 6 soldiers needed to stay alive. When the smoke grenade finally popped, marking the wounded soldier's location, Viper was ready. She brought the damaged Black Hawk into a hover over ground that should have been impossible to reach, her skids touching down in a riverbed barely wider than her rotor diameter. The din was overwhelming: engine noise, rotor wash, gunfire, and the shouted commands of soldiers loading wounded comrades. 30 seconds later, she was airborne again, climbing out of the valley with 3 critically wounded soldiers in her cargo bay. The Taliban fighters continued firing, their rounds sparking off rocks and filling the air with deadly fragments. But Viper was already gone, racing toward the nearest medical facility at speeds that pushed her damaged aircraft to its absolute limits. She made it to forward operating base Chapman with both engines still running and all 3 wounded soldiers still breathing. The medical team that met her aircraft worked with the practiced efficiency of professionals accustomed to trauma, loading the casualties onto stretchers and rushing them toward the surgical tents. Only then did Viper shut down her engines and assess the damage to her aircraft. The Black Hawk looked like it had flown through a storm of metal. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage, several rotor blades showed impact damage, and hydraulic fluid was pooling beneath the aircraft in growing puddles. By any rational assessment, the helicopter should have crashed during the firefight. That it hadn't was a testament to both engineering and the pilot who'd pushed it beyond every design specification. But Viper wasn't thinking about mechanical systems or engineering tolerances. She was thinking about the 6 soldiers still trapped in that valley, still fighting for their lives while she'd saved only 3. The mathematics of combat were always brutal, success measured in lives saved rather than lives lost, but the calculation never felt like victory when people were still dying. The base commander, a colonel whose own helicopter experience made him understand exactly what he'd witnessed, found her in the maintenance hangar an hour later. She was sitting on a toolbox, staring at her damaged aircraft while maintenance crews swarmed over it like surgeons working on a patient. "Captain," he said, settling beside her with the careful movements of a man who'd seen enough combat to understand when words were inadequate. "Hell of a thing you did out there." Viper didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, professional. 3 wounded extracted, 6 still in contact. Mission incomplete. The colonel studied her profile, recognizing the 1,000-yard stare that came after adrenaline faded and reality settled in. "Captain, you saved 3 lives today. Without your intervention, they'd all be dead. Without proper support, the other 6 will be dead by morning." It was a statement of fact delivered without emotion, but the colonel heard the weight behind it. He'd commanded helicopter pilots for 15 years, understood the psychological burden they carried when missions ended with people still in danger. The best pilots, the ones who made the impossible look routine, were often the hardest on themselves when impossibility lived up to its name. "The QRF is moving now," he said quietly. 2 Apache gunships and a Chinook with a full platoon. They'll be in the valley within the hour. Viper nodded, but her expression didn't change. In her mind, an hour was 60 minutes too long for soldiers who were running out of ammunition and medical supplies. Time in combat wasn't measured by clocks. It was measured by heartbeats and blood loss and the gradually diminishing sound of return fire. "Colonel," she said finally, "I need to ask you something. What's your assessment of my aircraft's flight status?" The colonel glanced at the bullet-riddled Black Hawk, then back at Viper with growing understanding. "Captain, that aircraft is grounded pending complete inspection and repair. Minimum 72 hours before it's airworthy again." "Hypothetically speaking, sir, if the situation were critical enough, if lives depended on it, what would be your assessment?" The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the intensity of a commander who'd learned to read the intentions of pilots who flew into places where angels feared to tread. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that lived in the gray area between regulation and necessity. "Hypothetically, Captain, I'd say that aircraft has maybe one more flight in it. Maybe, but it would be a one-way mission. The pilot would need to understand that there's no guarantee of making it home." Viper stood up, her movements sharp with renewed purpose. "Sir, I have a mission briefing in 4 hours for an operation that requires precision flying in extreme terrain. If this aircraft doesn't perform tomorrow night, people will die." The colonel understood immediately. The timing wasn't coincidental. Viper wasn't just another pilot conducting random rescue missions. She was the pilot for something big, something classified, something that couldn't be delayed or canceled because of mechanical problems. "Captain, even if we could get your bird airworthy, you've been in combat today. Flight regulations require a minimum rest period after." "Colonel," Viper interrupted, "with respect, flight regulations are written for normal operations. Nothing about tomorrow night's mission qualifies as normal. She was right, and they both knew it. In the world of special operations, regulations were guidelines that yielded to mission requirements and tactical necessity. If Viper said she needed this specific aircraft for a classified operation, then finding a way to make it happen became everyone else's problem to solve. The colonel made his decision with the same pragmatic calculation that defined all effective military leaders. "Chief Williams," he called to the senior maintenance supervisor, "what's your honest assessment of getting this bird mission capable by tomorrow evening?" Chief Warrant Officer Williams looked up from where he'd been cataloging battle damage, his weathered face skeptical. "Sir, we're talking about a complete inspection, hydraulic system repair, engine assessment, and structural integrity check. Under normal circumstances, I'd need a week." "These aren't normal circumstances, Chief." Williams glanced between the colonel and Viper, reading the subtext with the practiced skill of a career NCO who'd learned when to ask questions and when to simply make things happen. "Sir, if we work through the night, bring in additional crews and accept some risk in our inspection protocols. Maybe 18 hours, but I can't guarantee flight safety beyond basic airworthiness." "That'll have to do," the colonel said. "Chief, this is priority one. Whatever you need, personnel, parts, authorization, you have it." Viper watched the exchange with professional appreciation. This was how the military worked when it functioned at its best: competent people making difficult decisions and trusting each other to execute them without excessive bureaucracy or second-guessing. Tomorrow night's mission would succeed or fail based on these kinds of conversations, these moments when regulations yielded to tactical necessity. "Colonel," she said, "I appreciate what you're doing, but I need you to understand something. Tomorrow night's operation isn't just another mission. It's the kind of mission that determines whether the war continues for another 5 years or begins winding down in 5 months. The target we're going after isn't just high value, it's strategic level important." The colonel nodded slowly. In 15 years of command, he'd learned to distinguish between routine special operations and the missions that appeared in history books. Viper's presence, her aircraft requirements, and the timeline pressure all indicated something far beyond normal special operations tempo. "What do you need from me, Captain?" "Time, sir, and trust. When we lift off tomorrow night, we'll be flying into something that exists at the very edge of what's possible. If my aircraft fails, if the mission parameters change, if we encounter unexpected resistance, we won't have backup options. This is a one-shot deal with no second chances." The colonel understood. These were the missions that defined careers, that either elevated operators to legendary status or ended with flag-draped coffins and classified memorial services. The kind of operations that senior commanders authorized with full knowledge that they might be sending good people to their deaths in service of objectives that couldn't be discussed in public. "You have everything you need, Captain. And when you come back, if there's anything this command can do to support your operation, you have my word that it will be done." Viper extended her hand, and the colonel shook it with the firm grip of mutual respect between warriors who understood the weight of impossible missions. "Thank you, sir. See you on the other side." As she walked away, heading toward the operations center where Morrison's team would be conducting final mission planning, the colonel watched her go with a mixture of admiration and concern. In 30 years of military service, he'd met maybe a dozen people who possessed the unique combination of skill, courage, and judgment required for the most dangerous missions. Viper was clearly one of them. The question was whether even that would be enough for whatever they were planning to attempt tomorrow night in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Some missions succeeded because of superior planning and overwhelming resources. Others succeeded because someone was willing to fly into hell and trust their skills to bring everyone home alive. Tomorrow night would determine which kind of mission this was. As evening fell over Bagram Air Base, Morrison found himself in the unusual position of trying to brief his team on a mission that defied most conventional tactical frameworks. The target was accessible only by aircraft, the terrain prohibited normal insertion procedures, and their pilot was a legendary figure who'd supposedly been medically retired years earlier. If his men had questions about the unusual circumstances, they were professional enough to keep them to themselves. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, spreading detailed maps across the briefing table, "tomorrow's operation requires us to think outside every tactical manual we've ever studied. We'll be inserting via helicopter into terrain that's never been attempted by Special Operations Forces." Petty Officer Thompson raised his hand. "Skipper, what's the backup plan if the primary insertion fails?" Morrison met his eyes with the kind of steady confidence that came from 22 years of making life-or-death decisions. "There is no backup plan, Danny. We succeed, or we don't come home." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the focused quiet of professionals processing new information and adjusting their mental frameworks accordingly. Every man in the room had volunteered for missions where failure meant death, but most operations included contingency plans, alternate routes, and extraction options. This mission existed in the space beyond contingencies. "The pilot briefing begins in 15 minutes, Morrison continued. "Captain Reyes will walk us through the insertion profile and explain exactly what we're asking this aircraft to do. After that briefing, anyone who wants to step aside can do so with no questions asked and no impact on their record." Nobody moved. Morrison hadn't expected they would. These were operators who'd been selected precisely because they volunteered for missions other people wouldn't attempt. But offering the option was both tactically sound and ethically necessary when asking people to attempt something this far outside normal parameters. When Viper entered the briefing room, the atmosphere shifted subtly. She moved with the purposeful economy of someone accustomed to command, setting up her presentation materials with practiced efficiency. When she began speaking, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned respect through demonstrated competence rather than rank or position. "Gentlemen, what we're attempting tomorrow night has never been done before, not because it's impossible,